Sorry, you're going to have to bear with me. Technology sometimes is funny. I'm trying this new app out because it's new and I just have to try it out. That's the only reason. But this passage, I just got to be up front. You could speak on like 4, 6, 8, 16 weeks on just this chapter. So I'm going to take one chapter and make it into 1 week. So we got a lot to cover. But a little bit about me, because a lot of you guys don't know, I'm the youth pastor at this church. We got a youth group around 10, 15 kids, and we're intentionally keeping it around that size, which is a strange method, but Wade and I spent quite a lot of prayer over that, and the gist was that we want to have a mature, faithful group of individuals so that when our kids, you just saw them make a mass exodus, when those kids grow to be near middle school, they have something to grow into. In the pictures you see behind me, these are the two rocks of my life, my wife and my dog. They're the things I come home to every day. Megan's been there through the thick and the thin. She'll remain there, hopefully, God willing. The dog, it's clearly at Christmas time. He's having a heyday. But he's a great example of kind of what God's grace has been. It sounds like a silly comparison, but it's really real. I mess up daily, especially with him, and he's still there to love me each and every day, even though I don't deserve it. But a little bit about how I give a sermon, because you'll want to know. I usually have the little handout that's in your bulletin. Don't have to use it unless they're slaved away, putting these in your bulletins. But what I like to do is I like to give a beginning question, 1 to 3 of them, and the reason I do that is to open up kind of my opinion on a certain thing, so it's really a vulnerable spot for me, so you know where I'm coming from. It kind of opens up that wall, if you will, so you know where I'm coming from. And then I like to pray, give the reading, and then the sermon afterwards. But the biggest part that I really like to focus on is the last part, is the application about how we can make it about our lives. So these beginning questions, I'll read it straight from here. The first one, explain this statement. In order for us to receive the good news of the gospel, you must first believe the bad news about yourself. It's tough to really grasp. But I used to work at the Youth Opportunity Center. And if you don't know what that is, it is a place where individuals will go if they're a lot of the times court-ordered. It can be crime charges, drug charges. It can be a lot of different things. And really for an individual, for a resident there to really start to receive like actual healing and start to change their life, they actually have to admit that there's something wrong there to be changed. And I got 2 examples of it. I'm not using their real names just so you're aware, and it kind of protects them as well. Michael came into the YOC. He was actually my very first intake. So when I started, and then a couple weeks later, he came into the YOC, so I was kind of new to it. But he came in suffering from withdrawals, was addicted to methamphetamine, which is a very hard drug. Father was in jail for the same drug. He was homeless for 4 months, legitimately going from house to house, from shed to shed, just living homeless throughout Indiana, which blows my mind because he was 14 at the time. Was not able to sustain life for himself except through kind of dumpster diving and making a way. His mom was also under the influence of a lot of drugs. But both his mom and dad really hounded it to him that he wasn't there because of a mental instability. He was only there because of the drug charges. Does that make sense? They weren't saying, there's nothing really wrong with you, it's just you made a mistake and that's why you're there, and then once you're out, you're going to be just fine. And the reality was there was something wrong. And it's not like it was a issue that was going to hurt him the rest of his life, but it was something that he needed to address. He needed to address the addiction that he had and need to address how he got it and how to overcome it. And so one thing that happens with residents there is they earn phases, and once they get to phase 3, they're eligible for what's called a home pass. And this is the big thing, and this is the first step of getting out, more or less. And once you get your home pass, that's the last thing you want to be taken away from you. That's the gold right there. That's meaning you can go home for a whole weekend and come back and only be there Monday through Friday, which is a pretty good deal. It's not great, but if you're court ordered to be somewhere, getting home, Friday through Sunday, and then it extends Thursday through Monday, and then eventually you're just not there anymore. So Friday comes around, we learn that he's going to get a home pass, just got accepted as phase, so that's awesome. I'm super stoked for him because we had a good rapport with him. And Saturday, I come into work around 2:30, and I get there for like 10 minutes, and I get a phone call, and it's from like a jail in Indianapolis, and it's his mom had been imprisoned, meaning his home pass is gone, just like that, over nothing that he did. And that's devastating for a kid. For someone who can't really process their own emotions, having to go through that would just be heartbreaking. And there's nothing that compares to being able to go home and see mom that you really haven't seen or intentionally been with for months. And so, we're all heartbroken for this kid. Obviously, he's upset physically, verbally, emotionally. And we're trying to make it up to him, but there's nothing you can really do to make it up to him. There's nothing that can replace that. But I asked him, because I was involved with the church at the time and the worship team, I asked him, would you want to come to church with me? Most of the kids say no anyway, but it's a way to get out. I told him I'd take him to McDonald's afterward on me, so then he wouldn't have to worry about having to spend any of the money that he's earned there. So, a meal from McDonald's is better than a meal from YLC. So he took it. So I went and got him at 6 in the morning. We went there, kind of took the behind the scenes. He sat in a little leadership meeting, which he didn't say anything, just kind of took it in. And ironically, the sermon was about the fatherless society that we kind of live in. And he it struck him, and afterwards he kind of opened up. He's like, that's me. I was like, I was that kid. I was like, yeah. It's like you were. And I was like, but there's so much more hope for you that you don't even realize is there. And that's when he started to realize, he's like, I'm not here because of an accident. I'm here because I made a mental choice, but it's the things that led up way before that got me here. And I was like, yeah. And that's, this is a success story that I love to tell, because he's successful now, has a job, is working, is stable. He doesn't live with his parents. His mom's out of jail, but lives in a foster home, wants to be there because it's better for him, sees his mom when he can. But it's a great success story. However, there's a lot of the others. This other resident, Ed, as I'll call him, never really came to the conclusion that he had faults. Same story. Father was in jail. I remember it was my first court hearing as a recommended staff, and his mother told the judge that she would rather have him in the YOC than in society, which would be devastating to hear as a kid. And that really rocked his world, because then he immediately turned everything against everybody else and did not look introspectively at all, and started blaming everybody else for his reason to be there. And long story short, he is now 16 years old, serving an adult sentence. And that's just heartbreaking. It's once you start realizing the faults about yourself, that's when you can start getting to the good news that Jesus has. But it takes a little bit of humility and a little bit of uncomfortableness to get there. And the second question asks, if you had 1 hour with a person, how would you spend it? It's a good question. I don't really know. I would say share the gospel. I would say hang out with them, talk about their life, because after that hour, it's done. You don't get a follow-up. It's just 1 hour with one person. Talk about their life, things like that. Francis Schaeffer, pretty good theologian, said, if I had 1 hour with every person, I would spend 45 minutes talking to them about God's laws, and the last 15 minutes talking about his great salvation. And Wade's kind of been touching on this a little bit in Matthew and a little bit in John, about how the laws in Exodus, the Ten Commandments, are specific actions, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not worship idols, and there's 7 more. But he's also then been referring to Jesus, those are just acts, but the sin starts at the thought of it. It's in, you hate it in your heart. That's the sin. It's not the killing that's the sin. It's you hate it. That's the sin. You're looking at a woman lustfully. Those are the things that you need to be watching out for. And you think, can a man prevent emotional? Probably not. Can man prevent an action? A lot of times in the Bible it's illustrated that they can. And I think this is where Schaeffer's getting to. He's if I talk to them about God's laws and what they can't really sustain, then they have to listen to the salvation that's available for them for the last 15 minutes. And we're going to digest, and you'll understand why I asked those questions now, but I'm going to invite Tyler up and say a quick prayer before the reading. God, we ask that you be in this service. We ask that you speak through me and give me the words to say. It's in your name we pray. Amen.
They hurled insults at him and said, "You are this fellow's disciple. We are disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses, but as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from." The man answered, "Now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly person who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." To this they replied, "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And they threw him out.
Thank you. You're going to have to read the whole first part again. I'm just kidding, because of my question. Good thing is on the screen. So the first point, it says, sin does not define us. And it kind of goes back to the first part of it. And the disciples are confused. They're asked, "Okay, Rabbi," speaking to Jesus, they're like, was it him or his parents that sinned because he was born blind? So they're inferring to that sin has this direct relationship to an effect. So like cause-effect kind of relationship. And, we're thinking of this like post-Jesus era, and we're like, well, that's not true. But they also had some merit. Like, remember, they're thinking back in the Old Testament of like knowledge where they're pulling scriptures and pulling ideas from. So they had some merit here. Here's some examples in Isaiah. It says, iniquities cause separation from God. Jeremiah, sins caused deprivation of goods. Exodus, sins of parents caused punishment of children. You can take those verbatim as they are. But I don't necessarily think, and the reason I think this is because I think Jesus kind of starts to explain this throughout Scripture. I don't think these are meant to be taken as literally as they're written. What I think it means, if you look at it, we'll do each one, but inequities cause separation from God. So if I'm thinking of like an earthly example, if I don't talk to my father and I do things that my father doesn't like, of course we're going to be more separated. Like just physically, our relationship's not going to be as good. The second one, sins cause deprivation of goods. Well, in that time, if you sinned enough, you were probably cast out from the society, let alone being able to reap the benefits of what that society had to offer. The third one, Exodus, sins of parents cause punishment of children. You think, if my parents are constantly sinning, they're probably also not raising me in the home that's fit for like a safe environment. Now, I know everybody sins, but I'm saying like constant not wanting to change type of sin. And it just leaves a lot of room for interpretation there, but I always go back to, I love this book, but I always go back to, it's like, okay, what about Job? What about him? Like, I know he was a true man of God that had no result of sin, but was hurt, suffered. It's a complete result just of a fallen world rather than of the sin that he didn't really commit. And so the story of Job is a lot like the Old Testament stories. We get lost in it, especially this one. We're reading. It's kind of like a movie we're watching, and we're not really trying to digest what's happening. I mean, we're getting the gist of it, but it requires us to give some control over to God, for one. And we kind of see that throughout the story of Job, and I think most of the time people grasp that part. But the second one, the writer of Job is clearly illustrating the inadequacies of human logic. Like, the way we think about Job just doesn't make sense. If we think it, all of his friends were like, dude, why are you worshiping this God? Like, he killed your family, your livestock, like he took everything from you, and you're still praying to him. And that makes sense to us. Like, that's what we would say as well. And then a lot of questions, and this is a very youth groupy type question, so I've got to ask it. But, so if sin does not define our sufferings, we understand that part, and they usually grasp that. But the second question they always ask, does it make us a pawn in God's chess game? And this, you're going to have to bear with me. This is a very loaded question, and I know that. And I don't have 4 weeks to talk about this. And they don't necessarily ask this verbatim, but they're always like, so does God just kind of toy with me and kick a hurricane down on some state or something? And I was like, it's not necessarily for us to interpret that way, but what we do know is we know our world, and it's separated in a couple ways. Jesus and Paul illustrate Satan in a couple things that he has, and they said the prince of the world, John, Jesus is talking about him there, and then Paul talks about Satan and gives him the title of the ruler of the kingdom of air. Both of those are pretty initially scary. I had to read, and when I was preparing for the sermon, I was like, I don't know if I really want to say this, because I don't want to say something wrong. I don't know how educated I am on this topic. But the more I studied it, I was like, okay, this is really what they were saying and what they were referring to. But if you look at these, they're so defined. Prince of the world, nothing else. Ruler of the kingdom of air, great, because we're not going to be here eventually. This is so minuscule to what God's plan is. And that's kind of the next part, is God's eternal plan. Setting our minds on things above, setting our minds on higher things. And that's kind of what I tell them, because there's only 2 ways you can really apply this concept of being a pawn in God's chess game. One, we can deny it, and a lot of people do this. We can throw a fit, we can pout, it can be frustrating. This is the logic that Job's kind of describing. This is the human logic of it. I don't want to be controlled that way. I want to have a say for everything. Or we can accept that it's God's plan. We can see the higher way, but the way that's really nice to look at it, and I put it up here, is seeing it as a God-given opportunity to serve, to be on his mission, to love him, to love others, and it applies to every suffering that happens. If a car accident were to happen and I were to be in the hospital, I can use that as a ministry. I think one of our good friends from our high school, their whole family was a bunch of very fervent believers, and their dad died of cancer. But in the hospital, people's lives were changed because their prayer room was always filled, their hospital room was always filled, and the nurses and doctors consistently said, their lives were changed. My dad, who worked in the hospital, who's not necessarily a believer whatsoever, he was able to be oh yeah, that was pretty neat to see what happened. And then, we had a conversation after that. But I think that's a big part. Sin doesn't define us. Maybe we're a pawn. However, it's an acceptance that it's God's plan and that we're going to be a part of it and we're going to serve it. This next point is my absolute favorite. We can stay on this all day. A mess conveys cleanliness. So guys, this is literally a pass to tell your wives that you should just leave a mess everywhere. That's what this is. So wives, you don't have to listen if you don't want. But you can ask Megan. So we were cleaning our house yesterday, and I cleaned our spare bedroom. She's like, it looks so nice. I was like, yeah, so if we leave it like a mess more often and we clean it every so often, it's going to look great. I mean, if we keep it clean, it's just going to be the usual. But if we keep it like a mess, make that the usual, clean it, it's going to look spectacular. It's not the way it works, unfortunately. But I wish. But what I'm going to convey here is kind of like we see Jesus in this, and he sees this blind man, and he's like, all right, I'm going to heal you. So his first thing he does is spits on the ground, picks up some muddy clay, and wipes it on this guy's eye. Now, if you came to me and you had like a broken arm, and I'm like, let me fix you, I'm gonna spit, and I'm going to pick it up and rub it in your wound, you're going to be like, whoa, hold on. I'm going to go somebody else. Like, that's what would happen. And I have a story that my best man at my wedding wrote on Facebook. I'm going to read it, or else I'd screw it up. But he has a daughter, newborn, Aaliyah. Granted, he's my age, so he doesn't really know what he's doing as a parent, so I don't know if this is good or bad, so bear with me. But he said, as I was feeding Aaliyah last night, I was putting a burp rag under her chin to keep her neck from getting milk in the creases. I do this every time, and every time she cries out at me and just wants the milk, which can be frustrating because I'm positioning her to prevent sores, yet she fights it and pushes away. I feel like God goes through the same thing with us at times. We sense a need, financial, spiritual, physical, emotional, whatever it may be, and God wants to satisfy it, and while he's willing and able to satisfy it, he might have to position us in a way to receive it that prevents future harm or damage. Aaliyah fights me because she isn't mature enough to know patience and fully trust that I'm working in her best interest. Let's not be like babies that fight God's positioning for us to receive every good and perfect gift, but be mature and patient in our faith to recognize that he will provide. I love it. I mean, it's really applicable to what things happen. Sometimes you look at a suffering and you're like, God, just get me out of this. And God's like, no, you need to stay there a little bit to see what actually is to come. Let alone, if we're in a mess, do we ever consider it like healing? Like this man got mud in his eyes, and it wasn't that he was instantly able to see. We were reading it line for line, and we're like, oh, and then he saw, well, he had to walk to Siloam, wash his eyes, and then he could see. Like, he had to walk a little bit with some mud on his eyes. It didn't say that it just happened instantaneously. And then I'm going to summarize the rest, because if we read the entire chapter 9, Tyler would be mad at me for one, but two, you guys probably would have got lost the whole time. But summarize the rest, kind of where we left off, the neighbors, people who have seen him over time arguing if it's him or not. And he doesn't know, he knows of the name, okay? He knows the name that Jesus healed him. However, he was blind. Like, he couldn't physically see him. So if I was blind, someone healed my vision, I go walk, now I can see. Now it's like Jesus didn't walk with him there, so he doesn't necessarily recognize who did it. We'll get into that in a little bit. And then after that, the Pharisees get involved. And you love when they get involved in the New Testament because they seem to ruin just about everything they can. But they get involved. They ask the man. They don't believe the man, which doesn't make sense. So then they go to his parents. They're treating him like a child at this point. And then the parents, feared for being thrown out of the synagogue, are like, hey, he can speak for himself, kind of like throwing their kid on their bus. They're like, good luck. And then again, they ask the man again, and then he loves. I snicker every time I hear it, but he just blatantly asked me, he's like, do you want to become one of his disciples too? That's the most insulting thing you could have asked. And it's funny, because it's like smart alecky. Like, that's something I would have said. That's hilarious. And then they hurled insults, get upset at him. He says some other stuff, and they're just like, you can't lecture us, like, get out. And they say cast him out. And when I first read that, I think like out of the city, but it just means out of the synagogue, that he wasn't welcome in their presence at the time. With the third and final point we're going to spend a little bit on, it says, are we still blind? I'm going to read the part that usually is titled in Bibles called spiritual blindness. It says, Jesus heard that they had thrown him out, and when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus said, you have now seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. That's when it gets revealed of who Jesus is to this guy. Then the man said, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. Jesus said, for judgment I have come into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind. Some of the Pharisees who are always appear to be listening, and they ask, "What, are we blind too?" Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin, but now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains." A lot of application. Again, we're just going to kind of go through this slowly. First question we asked, are we still blind in our bad news? Kind of like the YOC residents, are we still blind in that lack of humility? It takes a lot of humility. It takes a lot of people kind of laying down their pride to admit that we have faults. And I ask why is it hard? It's uncomfortable. It's scary. And the worst is it makes us vulnerable. And vulnerability is like one of the toughest things in youth group. Like I hold discussion-based youth groups, which is I think is most beneficial for teens to like be able to talk and like let me observe the discussion. But sometimes you ask a question, they're all looking at you like, I'm not answering that. Good luck trying to get that one out of me. And that's tough. I mean, it's the same way with adults. You ask them a tough question, they're like, not right now. Ask me when no one else is looking. So vulnerability is hard. And then again, it relinquishes complete control to Jesus. That's not comfortable either. That's hard too, because Jesus isn't someone we can be like, hey, control this for me, and we trust and we can see him. You're putting faith in something, and that's exactly what it is. You're putting a lot of faith in something you can't see. And I look back, I was blind in my own bad news here, but when I was pursuing Megan, she was fervently saying no to me a lot. But I thought for sure that I was doing it the right way. Like, okay, I'm a Christian man, I'm going to do it the Christian way. I'm going to pursue her the right way, being intentional about it, do everything right. And I was completely forgetting, the most important part, like, why didn't I pray about it, like, once? Like, I completely forgot that God was part of that equation. And once I spent time in prayer, God then revealed some things that I needed to get in order in my life before, like, even considering asking his daughter out on a date. And then once I did that, then things started to roll. Granted, I gave her a little heart attack. She said that she liked me, and I didn't respond for like a solid day because I was still frustrated that she said no for so long. But it's like that. It's things so simple that we just forget about the bad news about ourselves, and we don't see the good news that we can. The next question, which I think is really, really, really important, have we received sight? So we've received the salvation that Jesus offers, but cannot hear or recognize Jesus' voice. A lot of times, this is going to be where the sermon gets hard, but a lot of times in our life, we have to repurpose our thinking and repurpose our strategy of certain things. People think they're following Jesus, and the way they've been doing it their whole life. And they keep going, and then they turn a deaf ear to what he actually wants. Like they're doing something, and then Jesus is like, hey, I need you to do something else. They're like, shh, don't talk. And it's so frustrating when you see it, because you see kind of what God wants in somebody's life, and you got to ask yourself, like, how many times have I had to repurpose my thinking? I'm thinking, like, in about 30 minutes, I'm going to have to repurpose my thinking, because, like, it's daily, it's constant that you have to do that to be sure that you're kind of doing what Jesus wants. And then the last part that's, gets me every time. How many times do we have to, or do we do something out of preference rather than out of love all the time? I mean, it's funny, because Megan will ask me, like, do you want to do the dishes? And the answer is no. Like, I don't want to do the dishes. I should do the dishes, but I don't want to. And I'm a really blunt guy, so I'll be like, no, and she'll look at me. I was like, I'm going to do the dishes. But, that's things where, like, out of preference, I'd rather just sit and be comfortable, but I should be loving her and serving Christ all in the same way that way. The next questions, are we claiming to see but are still blind? And this is the one that I'm going to really unpack. But so for those that don't know, I was a coach at Taylor University last year for basketball. And I was constantly learning new schemes, new ideas. I mean, it's my first year of college coaching. It's a whirlwind of busyness. All happens like that and then is gone as quick as it started. But before that, I was coaching track, and one of my assistant coaches, Mike McLean, this was his first year ever coaching track, didn't run track in high school. I just knew he's a good guy, and he knew things about speed and could run fast. So I was like, I need an assistant coach. Can you just listen to me and do this? So we were at a Hamilton Heights meet, and we were getting our butts kicked by Gearin Catholic. I mean, we were doing awful. And so you think as a coach, you would then go to your athletes and try to pump them up, like try to get them going. So I look at my assistant coach, he is sitting with the Gearan Catholic coach asking him advice. Like, what should I be doing? I'm lost. But you think, like, that's actually a good idea. Like, we're already losing the meat. Like, we need to be preparing for the future at this point. Like, wait, this one's gone. Like, we're not going to win. And, like, that gave us so much more ideas for, like, practices to come and things that we could do. And I think of the most successful coaches, and bear with me, I'm a 49ers fan. Colts really are on, like, the bottom of my list, so just hold on. Just don't. Like, there's steps here. I'm glad I'm at the top of a hill. But like Coach Popovich of the San Antonio Spurs, Coach Leslie of the UConn women, if you don't know much about them, they've won like the past 10 years. I mean, they're incredible. Belichick of the Patriots, sorry, he's a really good coach. Bill Walsh of the 49ers. I mean, the list goes on of like really successful coaches. And the things that they do, the first thing that they do is they stay true to the principles of sport and life. I put those both together. But and I've seen constant things because I'm learning how to do this for my own team. One of the things they do is it's serving others. So they're coming to every practice, game, meeting to give and not to get. So you're coming to give, not get. And that's a huge thing. And it's hard to do that. It really is, especially, I mean, I can imagine on the professional level of like coming to serve. Like that's your job. You're coming to get. But you need to be coming to serve. The second is communicate properly, and you see teams falter in this. You see interviews go awry. You see things not happening that shouldn't be happening. They communicate properly with their teammates, coaches, media, whoever. They hold each other accountable. I mean, we see this, again, I'm going to throw out a Patriots example, I'm sorry, but like a wide receiver messes up, and you see Tom Brady holding them accountable on the sideline. Sometimes it's not all the nicest manner. I'll give it to him. He probably could be a little nicer about it, but like, he's holding them accountable, like you've got to do your job. And they turned around in the Super Bowl. Thank goodness. That was a fun Super Bowl to watch. And then the last is positive body language. This is not as evident in national sports. And I think this is not evident a lot because TVs really like to show the negative action on the sideline. There is some, you've just got to be looking for it. I'm sure Troy can really attest to this, but in college sports, if you have a negative body reaction, it sucks the energy out of everything. Like, if you have a captain who's injured and just sitting in the fetal position, cornered crying, it's like you just ruined practice. Like, we still have 3 hours left, but that set the tone. And it's the same way in a game. If you have your all-star come off throwing a fit that they didn't score a bucket or didn't make as many points, even if their team's winning, it's like they lost the game. And that's the thing. Like, those coaches stay true to those principles. However, they're always learning and developing new schemes. Game to game, year to year, day to day, they're not doing the same thing. Like, they're changing it up. They're not becoming predictable. They're going to experiment with new philosophies. And they're going to be never too proud to learn new ideas. And that's the first thing I ever learned. It's like never stop. That's funny. The first thing I learned is to never stop learning. And you see it with complacent coaches. And I don't mean to like bicker, complain, but Chip Kelly, he was a 49ers coach last year, and you saw him do the same scheme that he's been doing for the past, 10 years. Granted, it had success. Let's not throw that under the bus. But it got predictable. It got complacent, and it plateaued. And that's the thing that in ministry can really hurt us, is if we start to get the same predictable, complacent, plateauing. And that's ministry in a nutshell. And so, like, we apply those principles to ministry. We think if we can, stick to the principles of Jesus' ministry, which is love, grace, forgiveness, you can see it throughout. We then don't have to remain blind for the spiritual growth opportunities that we have. We don't have to remain blind to the new ministries ideas that there are. I'm not saying you have to accept all the new ministry ideas. I get there's some crazy ones out there, but it doesn't mean you can't extend grace to those ideas. It doesn't mean you can't extend forgiveness when maybe those ideas don't work. I remember when I was in college, there was this thing called Campus Crusade, and we had a way of outreaching, and I was 100% against it. I was like, this is not going to work. I was a psychology major. I was like, I know human brain, this isn't going to work. And I tried my way, failed miserably. And then I tried their way, which I thought was stupid, to be frank. But I tried their way, and it worked. And it's like, I should have just been open to trying something. And if it didn't work, fine, I show it grace, just what Jesus would have done. But there's things that we can't do, and there's things we can't do to stay hardened in our spiritual hearts to growth or to new ideas. The Spirit's movement is so drastically different for each individual that we have to be open to it. This next part, which to me can be one of the hardest things to do in ministry, is to admit that something that I've been doing, kind of like the example that I gave you, just isn't working anymore. And when it's not working anymore, you're giving yourself a new opportunity to learn a new skill. That's hard. You're giving yourself an opportunity to give grace to an individual who has a new method or new idea. That's also hard. Or giving control to someone or giving your life over to Christ. That's also equally as hard. And it's just things like that is hard. And then we ask the same questions that the Pharisees asked. So what? Are we blind too? Are you? I mean, I can't answer that question, but I know daily I need to reflect on that question. And sometimes, there's people who are partially blind or mostly blind, things like that. That can happen in our spiritual lives. We can be blind to growth, blind to the Spirit's movement, blind to a new way of ministry, blind to extending grace, blind to what Jesus is saying. We can turn a deaf ear to him. I mean, there's multiple things we can be blind to. It doesn't have to be an all-encompassing just blind. And all those things we can fix and seek healing for. But the only way to really do it is to go in prayer. And that's so cliche. I know that's like, hey, you'll receive healing if you go to prayer. That's exactly what I'm saying. I know that sounds cliche, but hear me out. You can't go into the prayer without intent and without purpose. You have to go in the prayer with the intent that you're going to be humbled. God has a funny way of doing that when you're proud. You're going to be challenged. You're going to have to be willing. And then the part of the willing part is you're going to want to be changed. You can't go into a prayer not expecting change. You got to expect that God's going to change your heart, and hearts around you. And I think, giving God control through a humbled, willing prayer. Humble and willing don't sound too comforting there. It's like giving God control through prayer, easy. Giving God control through a humble, willing prayer, much different task. And I continually think about this as I invite the band back up. But when are we going to stop praying intentless prayers, and when are we going to start praying prayers like, help me see things that I'm blind to, help me realize what I need to be seen, help me realize the ministry that's out there that I'm missing. So I'd say just like this guy said, I mean, once you see it, it's like, man, once I was blind, but now I see. And that's the whole gist of the entire sermon. This quote at the end, it says, learn to love by showing grace. Neither power nor pride can show love or grace. Let us pray. God, we thank you for this time that you've given us. We thank you that you can open our eyes. We thank you that you can remove the blindfold and show us what we need to see and give us ears to hear when you're talking to us. God, we ask that you be ever present in our lives, that you can be so willing to challenge and to humble us, and that we seek you earnestly and full of intent. It's in your name we pray. Amen.